Hello, students. Today we are going to fast forward through American history so that you can get kind of a big picture of what it's supposed to look like. So, by the end of this lesson, you should be able to explain generally what happened in each century of the time frame from 1400 to 2020. So, this is sort of the big picture we're looking at today. First off, what is this? It's a guitar. When we're super zoomed into a time period, it's difficult to see the big picture. And throughout this course, we've been super zoomed in. So in today's lesson, we're going to look at the big picture. So we're going to zoom way out so you can kind of see what's going on. If you were wondering, it's that picture was a picture of one of these tuning pegs, and kind of the coil looking thing is the string. So zooming way out, this is what our timeline looks like. So in 1400, right here, we start with villages and farming. That's what everyone in the world was doing. 1492 is when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. 1500 to 1600 is the period of like Spanish colonization. That is when Spain is colonizing the New World and they're kind of dominant in this sphere. But starting in 1600, the English and the French and the Dutch also sort of join in on this party. In 1660, enslaved African Americans become the main source of labor. Sorry, enslaved Africans because they weren't American yet. In 1692, that's when the Salem witch trials happened. If you were here in October, we talked about those then. From about 1600 to 1750-ish is when pirates were a big thing. So if you love Pirates of the Caribbean or pirate stories, that's that century. In the 1700s, we have the French and Indian War and the American Revolutionary War. If you are into cowboys, that is like 1800-ish to about 1890-ish. There's like a really high point there in the middle, and there's sort of peters out at both ends. Also, in the 1800s, we have the Second Great Awakening, which we'll talk about when we get to that specific slide, and the Civil War. The 1900s are kind of a mess. We have World War I, Great Depression, World War II, Civil Rights Movement, and the Cold War. And then in the 2000s, I wanted to talk about the Great Recession and 9/11. So if you're zooming way out, this is kind of what the time period looks like. You'll notice we have more events kind of over here because it's more recent. It's harder for us to tell what's going to be like the most important when it was only 50, 60, 100 years ago. So in 1400, people are more alike than different. So most people in 1400 lived in small villages and farmed for their food. And that didn't matter. It didn't matter if you were living in Australia or Africa or Europe or Asia or North America or South America. You probably lived in a small village and farmed for food. I chose these pictures because they look similar, but I also wanted you to realize that this similar sort of house shape and kind of village design existed all over the world. So when we're talking about differences between different cultures, those differences are all kind of superficial and kind of at their core, people are basically doing similar things. So the other thing I wanted to talk about is history heavily favors written artifacts. So if you think about a typical day at school, you probably produce a lot of written stuff, right? You're writing notes, or you are taking a test, or you're typing on your computer, or you are filling out a worksheet or something. And so you get all of this paper evidence of your day at school, or today it's more digital. But if you think about your home life, you probably don't produce as much evidence from what you do at home, whether that's doing the dishes or playing with family members or hanging out with friends. There's not as much paper evidence of what you did. This is slowly sort of shifting with social media, but still most evidence that exists happens from these sort of formal events. So when historians are creating history, their access to information depends on what was written down. And so stuff that was written down gets more emphasis because there's more of it. So you'll notice in history, we often talk about what's going on in the government. We talk about what's going on in schools. We talk about what's going on between countries because those are sort of easy things. There's lots of evidence for it. What sort of things get skipped, though, are from groups of people who can't write or are forbidden to write. So we are missing a lot of information on what African Americans, enslaved African Americans' lives were like as slaves, because slaves were not allowed to write. They were forbidden. You could get killed for it. So we don't have a lot of information about how they felt or thought about what was going on there. We also usually are lacking information on what's going on in women's lives because, like we said, formal work produces a lot of evidence. But, doing the dishes and cooking and taking care of children, there's not a lot of written evidence that's produced because of that. So as we talk about these stories, this is something I want you to keep in the back of your mind is whose stories are getting told and whose stories are getting skipped because there isn't evidence. So in 1500, we have Spanish colonization. So 1492, Columbus. 1521, Tenochtitlan falls to Spanish conquistadors, and this is the Aztec Empire. So just 20 years into the 1500s, we are seeing these major civilizations being toppled by Spanish conquistadors. Also, at the same time, we get our Protestant Reformation beginning. We'll talk more about this later, but I want you to just know that this is starting in this period too, and it's going to kick off like 300 years of war in Europe. So what Spain does is they sort of perfect this mission model where they move in and they forcibly convert a region and they enslave the Native Americans on a mission style plantation. And this happens everywhere from Peru all the way up to California. So this sort of mission style of colonization. And we have talked about before how it was really awful and bad. I don't want you to get the impression that like Spain was worse than what everybody else was doing. When English people and French people move in, they do similar horrible things, but Spain gets the dubious award of being first in this. So in 1492, Columbus's journey set Europe on a collision course with the world. In 1500, most people in the Americas had never heard of smallpox. By 1600, millions of them had died from it. So smallpox and other diseases we think killed anywhere from 50% to 90% of the people who were living in North and South America in the 1500s. And so that kind of is going to set up the continent for some things that are going to happen later. But this like catastrophic population loss is one of the big tragedies of the 1500s. So what changes and what stays the same in 1500? So what changed? Spain is colonizing the New World. We get racial slavery for the first time. Africans are used as slaves. Spanish missions used as a way to control native populations, and we get sugar being grown in the Caribbean for the first time. What stays the same? In all across the world, most people are still living in small villages and they're still farming. And most nations are small and they're ruled by a king or a chief. And so this nation category is everybody from France and England to Japan to Korea to the Aztecs in Central America to the Iroquois in North America. Most nations are ruled by kind of a king or a chief. There are some exceptions, but this is kind of how most people are living. So in 1600, this is our English colonization century. So we get English colonization of North America, and at first they're using indentured servants. We talked about this, how people would be like, pay for my passage over and I'll work for you for 7 years. And wealthy plantation owners thought this was a great idea because those indentured servants usually died and then they didn't have to pay for anything else. But starting in the 1660s, this switches to enslaved Africans as their main source of labor in the Southern English colonies. And this switches because indentured servants start living longer. And so it becomes more expensive. And then in 1692, again, we have the Salem witch trials. So what changes and what stays the same in the 1600s? We get English and French colonization. Woohoo! Major religious upheaval in Europe. So in Europe in the 1600s is just constant war as Europe splits from one religion being all Catholic to being lots of different religions that are still Christian. So they have Catholicism, but then also Protestantism and Lutheranism and all of these other religions sort of pop up. We get the printing press, which makes it easier to share information. And so as the printing press becomes more and more used, we get more information being spread. And that allows people to build more on other people's discoveries rather than just having to start all over. So Most people are still living in medium-sized villages. They're farming. Because of trade with the Americas, we've introduced a lot of new crops. And so our villages have gotten larger because there's more food available in the form of like potatoes and tomatoes and uh, lots of corn and lots of other vegetables that were here in North America that have been brought to Europe, and fruits that were in Europe and have been brought to North America. Most nations are still small. They're ruled by a king or a chief. European nations are getting stronger by taking over their neighboring nations. So in England, we have England that takes over their neighboring country of Wales and their neighboring country of Scotland and their neighboring country of Ireland. In France, France is going to take over all of their neighbors, and Spain is going to do similar things. So we see these European nations gaining power by taking over other nations around them. And in the 1600s, they're going to run out of places to take over in Europe, and they're going to spread to taking over places in the New World. 1700s. So remember that printing press that we talked about? The printing press allowed people to build on their knowledge, and this leads to two separate things happening. The first is the Great Awakening, which is a religious movement that happens in the English colonies, but in Europe as well, where we have this return to biblical stories, and people are getting really excited about church and Jesus and all the things. So there's this movement of religious sort of excitement in the world. The second thing that happens is the Enlightenment, or the Age of Reason. So we have this religious excitement that's going on, but then next to it, we also have all of these scientific discoveries that are being made, because with the printing press, instead of being like, oh, if I want to see into the stars, I need to build a telescope. And so every single person was building their own telescope. All of a sudden, you can borrow somebody else's plans for a telescope and build and improve on what they're doing instead of having to reinvent things. In the 1700s, as a result of the taking over that we were talking about in the 1600s, we also get the French and Indian War, which in Europe is called the 7 Years' War. So we have these European countries who have taken over all of their small countries next to them, and now end up fighting each other in the colonies and in Europe over who owns what land. And we also have the American Revolution at the end of the 1700s. In the 1800s, which one of these feels more like the 1800s to you? Hopefully you thought both of them felt like the 1800s, but there's probably a good reason why they didn't. Oftentimes when we teach the 1800s, we teach thematically. So you will learn about westward expansion and cowboys, and you will learn about industrialization and factories, and you will learn about enslaved Africans and the Civil War. And all of these things are sort of taught separately. This year in this course, we're going to teach all of those things together because they were happening at the same time. So the goal from teaching that together is that you understand that, like, at the same time that we have immigrants moving into New York and working in factories, we have people moving out west and building homesteads, and we are dealing with slavery and the enslavement of Africans and the sort of consequences of that at the same time. So in the 1800s in Europe, we have Napoleon, which causes the War of 1812. We have the Great Awakening #2. So this is the second round of religious excitement that happens in the United States. If you are a member of a Unitarian religion or a Unitarian church or a Baptist church or a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, your religions kind of got their kickoff in this Great Awakening here in the 1800s. In 1860, we get the Civil War, which is the culmination of is America going to be a slave-owning nation or a free nation? It's the end of African American enslavement in the US. We have pioneers and westward expansion. We also have cowboys, industrialization, and factories, and all of that great stuff. So I want you to think about what life was like before the Civil War and after the Civil War, and the comparisons you can draw between those two. 1900, so this is World Wars and Change. So in 1900, we have World War I, World War II, and the Cold War. And I wanted to highlight the change in technology that happens because of this. So in World War I, we have trenches. Horses are still being used, and gas is used as a weapon. So this is like Wonder Woman. In World War II, we have Nazis, machine guns, tanks, nuclear bombs, airplanes, submarines. This is Captain America. And then the Cold War, we get lots and lots of nuclear bombs, and then we start getting our first like digital weapons and drone technology and things like that. So if you were born in 1900, when you were a child, your family would have owned a horse, and that's how you would have gotten to kind of school and the grocery store and everything. And by the end of the